been on the forefront of creating a change here, an awareness in farmers, all for our benefit, for healthy and more sustainable food for ourselves and our future generations. So we are deeply in debt for Charlie taking this head on, being kind of at the forefront, not only in America, but overseas and in other countries as well. And anyway, let's welcome Charlie Walters.
I'm not going to stand behind the podium because with my stature, about all you'd see is my head. And I know you get a little tired of just talking heads. Told me as sort of an ecologist here, but I'm actually an economist by training. And I'd like to talk to you from that direction a little more today. I look over there at Washington, and there seems to be a miasma coming up from Foggy Bottoms. And it all has that same litany to it. I've been misinformed. I don't know about you, but I remember the movie Claude Rains asked Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca, "What brings you here?" And Bogey says, "I'm here to check out the water." He says, "There's no water here. This is a desert." Well, Mogi, he stays about as calm as sculptured stone. And he says, "I've been misinformed." All of a sudden, we hear out of congressmen and senators how they've been misinformed. The great informers failed to tell them that Iraq was a nation of 30 million people, no air force of any consequence, no navy, no submarines, only a Mexican army, meaning mostly officers and not enough enlisted men. No missiles except those that would go less than 100 miles. And we were told that we were to buy into the proposition we're in such imminent danger that we had to go to war in a tar pit. And the reason being that we were misinformed by the CIA and the FBI. I don't know what solitary confinement cell some of the recent candidates for president have been in. But Edwards, Hillary Clinton, and a few others all voted to go into this tar pit. I noticed that Dennis Kucinich did not vote for that. In any case, we're here to discuss monetary matters. And I have to remind everybody that the Constitution tells us to coin the money and regulate the value thereof. I want you to take that statement, regulate the value of money, and hold it in escrow because we have to revisit that phrase again. Surely there's nobody that believes that you regulate the value of the money by printing 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 or $100 on a piece of paper. How do you regulate the money? That is the big question, the value of money. Not how much of it you put out, but how do you regulate the value of it? There are only 3 ways in which money can be brought into circulation. One is, as prescribed by the Constitution, to be issued by the government. But there we run the risk of having a disconnect between the amount of money and what's happening in the environment or in the economy. A second method is some sort of a credit device, which is the one we practice now. We borrow the money into existence, created by a debt. Money is debt. And the third system is to take the raw materials of the earth, including the impulses from the sun that come through us through the agency of the magnesium in the chlorophyll molecule, We produce with 6 basic storable commodities no less than 6.5 pounds of food for every man, woman, and child in the United States. If that production goes into trade channels at less than a par exchange, then it's not being monetized, and there's automatically going to be a disconnect between what's produced and what's consumed. To start out with, 75% of any economy is nothing more than ministering to the needs of families. Their clothing, their food, their fiber, and shelter. 70% of all the raw materials used to operate an economy are the raw materials produced off of our farms. Those raw materials should go into trade channels on par with wages and capital cost. And if they don't, then we have the problem that Say described in his theory. He said that the act of production has to create the money to consume the production. Or as Jefferson would have had it, we have to have broad spectrum distribution of land and money, which was quite opposite of Hamilton, who wanted the money to gravitate to a few strong hands so they could make investments and drive the nation forward. Now I'm quoting to you some of the material out of the papers of the old Raw Material Council of the 30s. Dr. John Lee Coulter, Dr. Charles Ray, engineer J. Carson Atkerson, and economic analyst Carl Wilkin. Now, Randy Cook mentioned Carl Wilkin to you the other day, and I will mention him again today in a little more detail later on. They concluded that the raw materials had to go into trade channels on par with wages and capital costs, and this was discerned by Professor George Warren. He figured out that there was no way you could keep depressions from happening unless the production from agriculture, from that 70% that it takes to use to operate the economy, would be on par with the rest of the economy. He sold that proposition to George Peake, and George Peake took it to Franklin D. Roosevelt. There was another man, Fred Stover, who was a farmer with the Farmers Union, and he got the ear of Roosevelt somehow. He could walk into and out of the Oval Office almost at will. So when that administration moved into action in the 1933s, they had in tow Guy Gillette of Iowa, Burton K. Wheeler of Montana, Elmer Thomas of Oklahoma, Arthur Capper of Kansas, and other great senators of that era. These were down-to-earth people. Guy Gillette was milking cows by hand till the night before he went to Washington to take his seat. You don't have that nowadays. They sat down and they concluded the only way they could swing what their objective was to make agriculture a public utility. They made it a public utility by the process of dealing with about 10 basic storable commodity from 80 to 82% of the harvested acres. Their idea was to do with them what Roosevelt had done, was doing with gold, monetize it. The idea was to pass legislation in various stages that would raise the commodity prices of these basic storable commodities, your wheat, your corn, your cotton, and so on, up to 90 to 100% of parity. Remember, at the depth of the Depression, corn was selling for 10 cents a bushel and hogs for 10 cents a pound. Through various acts, the AAA, part of which was declared unconstitutional, as you know, they were able to raise parity up to 70%, but Congress was skittish. It couldn't buy into the concept because it couldn't understand the concept. And so they made a law that it could have 70% of parity as long as the crop didn't exceed 70% of normal. That's where we were in 1937 and 38. Schechter Poultry brought a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, knocked out part of the bill. But the parity at 70% held. But in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Within a few months, 3 months to be exact, Congress had passed the Stabilization Act of 1942 that raised farm parity up to full parity. It was 90% of parity plus storage made it 100% of parity, and that's how we fought the war. By doing that, we gained a structural balance for the entire economy. I will explain what I mean by that a little bit later. For now, let me tell you what happened. Parity was achieved. Those basic storable commodities had to get paid on par with wages and capital cost as they entered trade channels. If the trades did not wish to pay that, then the farmer had the option of putting it into storage. And what this did was effectively canceled out the commodity exchanges. They sat there and did absolutely nothing because there was nothing to speculate on. This went on through the war. In 1946, at the end of the war, Truman took notice of the stability we had. If we'd have had a 15% income tax, we would have paid for the war by the act of fighting it. That's what structural balance of the economy does for you. So in 1946, they passed the Employment Act of that year, and that set up the Council of Economic Advisors, and they were charged with publishing the President's Economic Report, which made use of the economic indicators, which was developed by Simon Kuznets for Roosevelt in the early years of the 30s. Now, that President's Economic Report made use of the Kuznets formula, which broke down the American economy into 6 component parts. Now, all of you have pads in front of you. If you want to take your pencil, you can write this down, because we're going to construct a T account here. You have the income sectors of the economy. Those are corporations, unincorporated enterprise. I won't go too fast if you want to write it down. Then you have rentals. Rentals includes one of the sectors or aspects that's very dear to my heart, and that's royalties to book authors. And last, agriculture. Those 4 sectors, based on the database that we have going back to the days of Hamilton, tells us that we have to have 33 1/3% of the national income flow through those 4 sectors, because 66 2/3 of the national income have to flow through wages and capital costs and supplements and a couple of hundred other little things that fall under that. Now in a T account, the 4 on the left, the 33%, and the 66% falls on the right. If you want to have full employment, you want to have no rupture of price structures through import invasion. If you want to have general stability and no real inflation, that's the equation. Now what do we have instead? We have right now about 17% of the national income going to the 4 income sectors. That's about the same as it was when Roosevelt took over, 17%. And you have, when you do that, you've ushered your country into a massive depression. Or you've uncorked enough debt to substitute for earnings to take it in the other direction. The Council of Economic Advisor chief was Edwin Noers. His deputy assistant was Leon Kaiserling. Noers departed after the first issue of that great book came out, and Leon Kaiserling became the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, the second one. I had occasion to interview Leon Kaiserling, and I appeared on a platform with him one time down in Texas at an REA meeting. In a lighter moment, he told me what happened. After the Council of Economic Advisors was established in order to provide the statistics so we could maintain this equation for the United States, all hell broke loose. Cargill, Continental, Bunge and Bourne, Dreyfus, and Andre started importing goods into the United States. They imported so much grain and so many storable commodities that we piled up a surplus. And that surplus was taken to Congress and says, look, these farmers are producing too much. There's too many farmers. We're going to have to do something about this. And so they came up with the Farm Act of 1948. The Democrats had their Brannan Plan, which was something similar, but the Republicans had the 80th Congress, and they had the votes. And they knew how to count them. And they wrote the Farm Act of 1948, and that act set up a scheme to take agriculture, not keeping it at the full parity, but to bring it down to a formula of 60 to 90% as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture. They gave Truman 2 bills to sign. One of them was to continue full parity for 1 year. The second one was to go to the 60 to 90% after that. Truman signed those bills because he had to go into the convention at Philadelphia, where he was nominated to fight Thomas Dewey for the presidency. He figured he could straighten it out in the balance of his term if he won. Well, Truman won, but he failed to straighten it out. We had temporary measures that kept parity coming to the end of the Truman years, but then it was all over, because when Eisenhower was inaugurated, his new Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, immediately told the people at a press conference, we're through mollycoddling the farmers. We're going to go to a realistic program of bringing production into line with demand. They struck down parity. Not all of it at first. We're down to about a third of what it ought to be. But in those days, they only lopped off 20, 30%. By 1955, hogs were back to 10 cents a pound, and corn was back to 10 cents a bushel, and the other storable commodities were in ranges similar to that. We've been there ever since. For the last 10 administrations, we've taken and reduced farm parity and therefore the income to the income sectors of the economy. We've reduced it back to where it's about 17% again right now. Now, what have we done otherwise? In the last year of the Eisenhower administration, they dumped some more money back into the economy because they saw what they were going to do, but it was credit money. And that credit money, by the end of the Johnson administration, had doubled. And then it redoubled again. Every 8 years since then, it's redoubled. Now I'm talking about 8 or 9 administrations. It's doubled and redoubled and redoubled. And as the King of Siam would put it, etc., etc., etc. Well, where are we now? Someone in this conference the other day said we had $26 trillion public and private debt. Well, I didn't know it was that, but here's what we figured it was. If we take the amount of money that was paid to agriculture and enlarged it over here to what it should have been if it had been receiving parity, and then we have a figure for what the shortfall was by counties and by states in the agriculture, counties and states of the United States. That shortfall cumulatively between 1950 and approximately the present comes to 26.347 trillion dollars. Well, logic tells you that has to be. It can't be any other way. If we don't have the earnings, then we're going to substitute debt for earnings. And the debt is going to pyramid itself until it's exploding out into space at 40 miles an hour. Now, apparently Mr. Greenspan doesn't comprehend this. We're going to continue to pile up debt. Now, how can we keep the debt coming? When the bombs went off over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Mr. Truman assigned to Dean Rusk and George Kennan and one of his deputies the task of dividing Korea so that the Soviets could take the northern half, the surrender of the Japanese, and we could take the southern half. Now, this was a blank check, so we would have a war later on, which we did 5 years later. Mr. Truman gave some ships to the French so they could hold the French Foreign Legion back into Vietnam to retake control of their colony. Of course, that one ended up in Dien Bien Phu, but we replaced the French, and we have another war. Wars keep the credit coming. Gore Vidal figures that we have deployed troops into foreign countries 144 times since Korea up to the present. Not just Colombia or Panama or Iraq once and twice, but all kinds of countries you haven't even heard of. Some of them were only small groups, the 10,000 or 5,000. But we've kept the credit coming because we've kept the war machine coming. In the meantime, agriculture continues to languish. At the time I worked with the National Farmers Organization in the 60s, we were losing 2,400 farms a week in and week out. That number has not greatly diminished. It's still going on because we have a policy of putting the land into a few strong hands. Well, what's happened to the strong hands? Without being paid for as much production as they produce, most of them are technically bankrupt. Oh, the prices of American products are at the world level. That's what the Farm Act of 1948 designed for us. But that great big wheat farmer that's running 3 sections of ground out there in western Kansas, he's technically bankrupt. He gets a big subsidy check, but that subsidy check bounces once off the table before it goes to the bank. So basically, the subsidy to agriculture is a subsidy to the banking system. I used to have a good friend who was a banker. He's passed on now. Had many great sessions with him. He ran the bank at Hartington, Nebraska. Vince Rossiter. Vince Rossiter told me that during the parity years, banking was totally unprofitable. He said that that the truth of the matter is, if it was known, the banking system, up to the point they started monkeying with this parity arrangement, could only find a market for about 17% of the money they had a right to loan out under the system that we use, the marginal reserves, or whatever they call it, fractional reserve. Only 17% market out there. But once the farmers started being shortchanged, then the banking became profitable. Almost immediately, the bigger farmers had to come to the bank, hat in hand, to borrow money to put out the next crop. The government gave out subsidies to keep the rate of bankruptcy from getting too wild, so the natives wouldn't get too restless. So we got subsidy programs, and we have milk marketing orders, and we have regulatory systems, all designed to lard out a little bit of money to make up for the shortfall, because we're operating on this one world idea. The system is quite simple. There is an average, or a median, as the statisticians say. The ones who were above that, they were the blessed ones. Sometimes they even made out. Some of them made a profit. But the ones that fell below that median line, they were earmarked to go out of business. They were going to be the ones to set up the sales notices, having decided to quit farming. Next year, there would be a new bunch that fell under that line, and more up, and those above it, of course, hung in there. So the land kept gravitating to fewer hands, but I can't say that they are strong hands. Right now, we're exporting about as much as we're importing by way of foods. We're not self-sufficient across the board. Now, what about the rest of the economy? I said 70% is agriculture. 30% of the raw materials, mines, oil, shale, gravel, cement, those kind of things. They have usually done very well in taking care of themselves and keeping their price up to where it has to be. It is agriculture that has dropped from around 14% of the national income on that income equation I told you about, down to less than about 0.5% today. We are not paying our commissary bill, and because of that, we have got a debt that is mounting up exponentially. There's an old little story they tell the French school children. If you drop a leaf into the pond the first day, and you double it the next day, and you double it the next day, and at 30 days, the pond is full. When is the pond half full? Well, the answer is the 29th day. I suggest that we are near the 29th day. We need to figure out, how do you monetize the production so that the act of production delivers the money to consume the production? The parity program of World War II was probably the greatest one that ever came along. I have talked to economists, some of the people like Graham, who wrote the Storage and Stability book.
5 minutes.
5 minutes will be plenty. Storage and Stability book and so on. And we theorized that if the United States took and monetized the 25 biggest storable commodities, including gold, and made those prices the world price, then you could help some people off the floor in some of these foreign countries. Colin Clark, the Australian economist, had his idea of equity of trade. The big economy of the world should protect itself so that it can't be destroyed by income invasion. But if it buys something from the rest of the world, it shouldn't cheat the rest of the world. If we buy copper from Zambia, we should pay Zambia an American price. And that price should be held in escrow so they can take from America any production they want at an American price. This thing that we're into now started with GATT in 1948 and has morphed into being the World Trade Organization, is a one-way track to disaster. It can only hold as long as the oil supply holds and as long as that there's not a big world war. And I'm not sure that we're not going to have a problem with both of those. The management has assigned to me 60 Swiss seconds to take any questions.
No silence. Connie Fogel from Canada, the Canadian Action Party. You're talking about the subsidization program, and maybe the concept of the parity you described could also be considered as a form of help, subsidization. I'm thinking of the World Trade Organization, the globalization process where, a few people take all the resources of the world. And I know that agriculture has been on the front line of the attack through the World Trade Organization. And they don't want the subsidization anywhere in the world. And in their discussions and their talks and the various agreements and arrangements that they're creating throughout the world, they're getting these promises and actions from nation to nation to reduce this various forms of subsidization. So I'm wondering what your take is on that process where they don't want the subsidization. The United States has been one of the countries that's been, though they're part of the WTO, they have been refusing to cooperate as much as the demand is for the World Trade Organization for that reduction of subsidization. So what is your take on the World Trade Organization demands about that, getting rid of subsidizations, and how United States or Canada or anywhere else can function so long as we remain in the World Trade Organization?
Well, I don't know how to diagram that sentence, but first of all, parity is not a subsidy. Parity is not a subsidy. That is putting it into trade channels on par with the rest of the economy. Now, what we're doing now, trying to make this unreality called World Trade Organization work, is with subsidies. The United States still has to deal with what the people want to some extent. And if they don't have some subsidies, these farmers, for instance, if you don't have these subsidies right now, you're not going to put in a wheat crop next year at all. They're bankrupt. That subsidy check that you read about on the internet is a subsidy to the bank. They told you the other day how much the banks get in by way of subsidies through this rubric of bonds going out and they buying them back and creating money out of thin air. The problem with the World Trade Organization, it is a faulted system. and it is designed to keep about 4 billion people on planet Earth on the mud floors. And they're not going to get off of it. Now, the only thing that can remedy that is for the top economies to create a world parity that is commensurate with their standard of living and their state of the arts. And let the benefits start flowing out to these third world countries. Right now, we've got our industrialists hunting the world over to find poverty pockets where they can put a factory or harness the labor or in effect create a new form of slavery and bring the stuff into the United States or Canada Walmart style.
Back now, it's gonna-
Gentlemen in the back.
Could you elaborate on the role of oil?
Well, what we're doing is using an import product when we should be developing our own energy source. When I was running a magazine called Gasohol USA, we made the computation with some experts that if we planted fast-growing poplar trees along the interstate highways in the rain belt part of the country where they'd grow and harvested them every 2 years, we could grow enough biomass to service the automobile fleet of the United States. We're in a tar pit with Islam, and it's not going to improve, and it's not going to change as long as we act like this oil thing is going to last forever. It won't. And I don't think there's any way that we're going to find enough oil here. We should be looking at alternative sources right now. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've always had the view that because we don't do the fundamental things, we look for command and control things that kind of sort of work. And in this case, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, if we said we will stand by third world countries who repudiate their foreign debt, and we stand by foreign countries who want to take control of their land and natural resources, that they would have no reason to sell us products at an exploitive wage, and we would have no reason to have another bureaucracy to decide what a fair price is.
Well,
So my sense of it is that this fair price mechanism, one has a vested interest of American farmers who don't want them to sell us things at all, which I don't necessarily support. And then the other part of it is these people are desperate. If we take away their ability to sell us products cheap and they can't sell us products at all, how are they going to pay their debt?
all right.
You need to have a question instead of just comment.
This starts.
The question is how are they going to pay their debt, and wouldn't repudiating their debt remove the need for this command and control stuff?
Not particularly, because you're not going to change anything if you just repudiate the debt. What you have, rather than this rosy idea that you're suggesting, we've been running around the world ever since World War II, extinguishing democracies, supporting dictatorships, all to accommodate an oligarchy that's working the international disparities against each other, and this is what's impoverishing the people. Now, you say, Mexico isn't selling us corn. We're dumping corn on Mexico to the point I interviewed one of the head agronomists in Sonora, and he told me a third of the farmers are leaving the land. Why? I said, because you're dumping stuff on us, and they're heading for the American border. We got 10 or 11 million Mexicans in the United States have been driven out of their own country by this world trade process and this NAFTA and CAFTA type stuff.
Mr. Walters, I
Yeah.
really wish to congratulate you. I've been in the farming business for many years and analyzed those very same things that you were talking about. The high end, which you hit on what to do. For the first time, I've heard the answer for what to do between world trade, agriculture-wise, in world trade. you do have that right answer.
Thank
I
you.
didn't have it.
I'll
And
tell you one thing. It takes, and this is a very well kept secret, it takes no more than 1 or 2% of imports of a basic storable commodity to bring the American price crashing down to the world level. In the case of cotton, it doesn't take that much. It only takes 0.5% in terms of domestic production. So, you know, they don't have to import very much. These trades were able to import just a token amount and totally destroyed our legal system because we didn't have the wit, and our editorialists didn't have the wit to tell people what was happening.